Hello friends, my name is Marines and I'm involved in a project where a group of us decided to read the Goodreads winners over the last 10 years to talk a little bit about who wins a Goodreads Choice Awards, whether we agree with the decisions. Each of us have a category. We are reading the winners for the past 10 years. All of the videos will go up today so you can click around and see all of our thoughts on the specific categories that we are reading for. And I read for the debut category. I will be honest and say that I originally wanted like maybe fantasy or something like this, but I think I ended up lucking out in terms of getting debut because a lot of people participating had to read like series to get to their winner. Debut by its very definition means that this author has only written one book, so I didn't have to deal with any series. I also didn't have to deal with any like super big name authors because these are debut authors. Like they might be bigger names now, but this is an interesting category to think about in the context of the Goodreads Choice Awards, which we just sort of accept is a popularity contest. And so a lot of times authors with a deep backlist or like a large following end up winning these things. But what does that mean for the debut category? So I guess that's what I'll be exploring in this video. So, okay, it is February 1st. If you see any of the videos from anybody else participating in this challenge, chances are they started in December or January. Like I've known about this project for a while now, but classic me, like I can only do things under the gun, like procrastinator, also mood reader. So, you know, over the next 13 days, not even 14, because I need time to edit this. Over the next 13 days, I have to binge these books, but we'll go through each of these one by one and I will tell you if I've read it, if I'm reading it, if I'm rereading it, and all of that jazz. And we are starting with the 2013 winner, which is Tangled by Emma Chase. It is February 5th. I recorded that introduction. I have now finished my first book in this project. So a couple of things that I want to add. First is that I'm going to timestamp all of these books that I'm going to talk about because I want to talk about them with some details of plot. Like I don't know how spoilery these are going to be. It depends, I guess, like what specific elements I want to pull out from the books themselves, especially as like comparison points as we're talking about like these as winners, as a group of winners. So I'm just going to issue this general spoiler warning and I will timestamp each of the titles in case there is one that you really don't want to hear spoilers about. I will also timestamp the end because I will do a non-spoilery sort of wrap up of all of the titles at the end. I will rank them. I will talk about them in comparison to each other. So if you hate spoilers entirely for books you haven't read yet, you can skip to the end and get all of that information. Okay, so I finished Tangled by Emma Chase. This is an adult romance book and I'm going to give you an overview of the entire story. We have a man who is an investment banker. He is very much a playboy, living a playboy lifestyle, and he meets a woman at a club and he's instantly attracted to her, but she is engaged and she kind of brushes him off. Turns out that this woman is his new coworker, and the fact that she's engaged doesn't really put him off, and the fact that she's his coworker doesn't really stop him from making very like sexual harassment-y sorts of comments. She ends up breaking up with her fiance and they hook up, and this man very quickly realizes that his feelings for her are deeper than he could have ever imagined. He's never felt this way about a woman before. So they are together for like a weekend, honestly, and then sort of a miscommunication thing happens. He sticks his foot in his mouth. They have a falling out and he takes it very hard as he comes to realize that he doesn't want any other woman in the world. This is it for him. So he does some groveling. You know, it's kind of groveling. It's kind of like bullying her into giving him a second chance, and they do reconcile and it ends with happily ever after. Before I get into my thoughts on this one, let us just collect some data here. Currently, it has a 4.05 rating on Goodreads, and that is with 115,591 reviews. I really hated this. I was very tempted to DNF multiple times. Here's what makes this absolutely terrible is that we are in this main male character's first person narration, and he is like a flaming misogynist. It's very like indicative of like early 2000s, early 2010s sort of misogyny, like where he's just like, I'm a man's man. and like, I'm just a playboy and women are only good for one thing. And so I was sitting there and thinking, okay, this is like the beginning of his arc. Like, we're meeting this guy who's really terrible. But even if that were the case, where we're meeting this guy, he's been a playboy, and then so his arc is learning how to respect women because he fell in love with this one woman, like, that's never going to be a story that I particularly enjoy or like want to read. But whatever, if it was going to be that, I was like, fine, we gotta like sit in this stage of the story where he's literally like mid-blowjob and telling us about how much he doesn't like women or respect women as humans and things like that. Like, he introduces us to his sister by calling her the bitch, and he like calls her the bitch throughout the entire thing, and all we ever see that she does is like try to care for him. Misogyny, rampant misogyny. So anyways, I was like prepared for this arc of like he falls in love and learns that women are people after all. But like, that misogyny doesn't ever go away. It is like, oh wow, I met a woman who has changed my mind about women, but he's still like the same awful asshole that we met on page 1. And so we just spend the entire time with this guy who is worthy of nothing and then gets to like fall in love and be happy. I honestly, I don't understand. Why did people rate this highly? The thing is that like, it's effective in that like, I hated this guy. Like, good job, Emma Chase, you wrote a misogynist well. But I also think that it was supposed to be like funny or charming, or by the end we were supposed to like root for this couple, and I just never got there at all. I hated this. I didn't have a good time reading it. I gave it 1 out of 5 stars. Moving on, the 2014 winner is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I obviously own a copy, and this has been on my TBR shelf for many, many years. I kind of unhauled this at one point. Like, I had a lot of books that I unhauled through my unhaul project, and then they sort of like languished in a closet because it was mid-pandemic, and I've been getting rid of them now little by little, donating and things like that, but I still had this. So, you know, look at God. I think part of the reason that I never got to this is that I've heard a lot of mixed things about this. Obviously, it has its fans. The whole series has like a lot of dedicated fans, but I had heard the complaints about misogyny in this. So I'm about 60 pages in, and I'm not gonna lie, I have also already thought about DNFing this one. First, I think that the very beginning was a little dull to me. It got better, but then we were introduced to the main character's wife, and as soon as we were introduced to the wife and she was like beautiful and flowy and everyone loved her, I was like, she's gonna get fridged. This woman is gonna get fridged. I knew it. I knew it in my heart. I knew it in my body. I knew it in my soul. I'm gonna push my way through this one too. But I'm not having a very good time right now. I finally finished reading Red Rising, and honestly, this has put me so behind schedule, even worse than I already was. I'll start by saying that I didn't enjoy the plot progression in this at all. This felt like a series of very loosely connected events. So our main character is essentially enslaved. He believes that he is part of a group of people who is working to terraform Mars so that it could be inhabitable in some future. And what he discovers is that actually people have been living on Mars for like hundreds of years, right? They've been lied to. These people have been enslaved to basically work for the higher caste people who are enjoying the surface of Mars. In the opening chapters, his wife is killed. We'll talk about that more again in a little bit here. And he is rescued by a band of like rebels in this world, and he finds the motivation to also rebel. And what that means is that he's enrolled in the institute where the high class, like genetically modified people in this world attend. And it's supposed to be like the school that is like preparation to become like a fascist dictator, I guess, in this world. But nothing about that makes sense to me in terms of like putting all of your best and brightest people in a school and having them kill each other. Like, that doesn't seem like the thing that people who are interested in preserving a caste and preserving like a gene pool would do. It doesn't make a ton of sense. And just watching our main character learn how to be like a fascist murdering through the school, and the fact that we just get there and they're like, oh, well, kill each other first, and then like, okay, war games, in a way that I was like, I am not there isn't a strong sense of like how things are progressing, if they even are progressing, because we end the book and there isn't a ton of progression for our main character, even motivated by the fridging of his wife, or in any ways that he does change, it's probably for the worse. The main character is also just like the best at everything. He's just really good. Even prior to being genetically modified himself, he was like super good at everything, and we get to see like what he goes through in the genetic modification, but it doesn't feel like a true training montage where something is earned, because a lot of what he is given in like enhanced strength or whatever is given to him. And there is a super rough recovery from that, but again, it doesn't feel earned in a way that is contributing to any sort of arc at all. And because of all of that, because of how disconnected this all is and how flat the main character is, I was super bored. I was super bored through entire chunks of this. The writing in here is also incredibly repetitive. There were things that were just told to us over and over and over again. All of the world building and his descriptive style is telling rather than showing, and so we are told things over and over and over again. Plus this has a lot of characters, and it was just a lot of like proper names being thrown out at us in a way that I didn't always retain, because the characters were pretty flat and there weren't things that were like differentiating them. Plus, on top of all of that, there was like a style of talking, almost like a dialect for the Golds, that is supposed to be sort of affected, but also in getting all of this affected sort of dialogue and these like grandiose speeches and whatnot, like we, the reader, also have to suffer through this. And so that's like all of the dialogue in here is in that style. And I already wanted to bang my head against the wall. That certainly did not help. So that was a fail on the characters, the world building, the writing, and the plot. And then on top of all of that, this had the audacity to be misogynistic and homophobic. Okay, the fridging of the woman was like the first clue, right? But okay, you could say like, oh, that is like so indicative of fantasy of the time, like whatever. But that was only the first straw to me. Like we get the fridging, he's like, oh, now I shall rebel. He moves on. He has these like random moments where he's like, my wife, but nothing about her death. I don't know, the entire like leap between her death and now he's rebelling, but he's rebelling by becoming part of the system. And like the way that he participates in the war games, I'm like, what? He does spare some thoughts for like, oh, my wife wouldn't recognize me now. It just felt like lip service, because then he would just keep doing the same things. But okay, so his wife is fridged, but we get into this world and there is so much gratuitous violence against women. So they're playing these war games, and then the women who are participating in the war games are just taken as spoils of war, and they are raped repeatedly throughout this. And in a way that I don't understand why this misogyny was included in here specifically. Especially because if we're talking about the highest caste of women who are genetically modified, why would those women then be described as weaker than men? Like nothing about the misogyny made sense in the context of this world, not even as a device to like darken the world. This felt like misogyny bleeding through from our world, if that makes sense. It just was really terrible to read. Even our main character is like positioned as like not as bad as the other people in this world, but he would have moments like that he came across like a woman on an opposing team, but she could cook, so he knocks her out, throws her over his shoulder, and like takes her away as a spoil of war, because nobody cook, woman cook, get in kitchen. And I was just like, this is our hero. There was also like some casual homophobia in this. There were multiple comments that were like insinuating like, ew, they might be gay, or like, ew, they did some gay stuff. And nothing about this was enjoyable to read. It does not stand up or hold up at all in 2023. I don't even know if you missed all of the misogyny and homophobia when you read it. I still could not even begin to guess what people enjoyed about this at all. Like I'm honestly confounded by this entire experience. 1 out of 5 stars, because 1 is the lowest that I can give. Truly miserable. Okay. So next up is the 2015 winner, which is Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I have already read this. This was actually the first video review that I ever did on this channel. I feel like had I had more time, I might want to revisit this or like skim read it. I still might go through and skim a little bit just to refresh my memory or to check out like maybe the opening chapters and see how I feel about the writing. And then the 2016 winner was Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton. I have so many books to read and 4 days. All right. Let's do this. It's February 11th and I finished rereading Red Queen. I know I said I was only going to reread the first couple of chapters or like skim read or something, but it was going by so quickly and I had forgotten so many of the details that I just finished it off. Before I get into my feelings, because with Red Rising I just jumped into my feelings and forgot stats. So right now Red Queen has a 4.02 rating on Goodreads, and that's with 876,648 ratings, making this one the most popular to date. Red Queen is another YA fantasy, and it is about a world, a society that is split between the color of people's bloods. So the red bloods are the commoners and they are ruled over by the silver bloods, who also have superhuman abilities. And our main character is a young woman named Mare, who discovers that she has silver-like abilities. And so to cover up the fact that this is even possible and help try to quell the rebellion that is bubbling amongst the reds, the royal family decides to pass Mare off as a long-lost silver and marry her into the royal family. What's really interesting about Red Queen is that back when it came out, it was actually compared a lot to Red Rising, and not favorably. A lot of people were saying that Red Queen was a sort of rip-off of Red Rising. You have, you know, the color coding, you have the split between the commoners and the ruling class with the superpowers. But I find that comparison really hilarious because I find both Red Rising and Red Queen very generic. Both of them are incredibly generic and they both feel derivative of like other works in the YA fantasy genre. And here's going to be one of my spiciest takes of this entire video, but I gave Red Rising 1 star and I would give Red Queen like 1.5 or 2 out of 5 stars. And if you held me at gunpoint and you told me I had to reread one of these books, I would reread Red Queen for a 3rd time than reread Red Rising. And I stand by that. I stand by that. I know people love Red Rising. I just read both of these books back to back, and I am here to tell you that while neither of them are particularly awesome or good, Red Queen at least is readable, and its generic YA fantasy plot follows like a more sensical progression to me. Red Queen just feels like a bunch of nothing, and it also has a very simplistic style. It has more of a focus on relationships and romance, so I would even make an argument here about like the misogyny that lends people to reward Red Rising and hate Red Queen. You know, maybe we don't have time to jump into that in this video, but I feel like that's kind of there. The writing style is a little bit different. So I found both writing styles to be super repetitive. I will say that Victoria Aveyard's style is plainer. There's something a little younger about the writing style as well. So I feel like people read Pierce Brown's like inflated, almost pompous style and are like, oh, that's better than Red Queen, which is a lot more stripped down and simple. But again, I feel like the Red Queen style is more readable, and I didn't feel like banging my head against the wall, which I did while reading Red Rising. I'm doing a lot of comparison here because all of my other feelings about Red Queen are like, this is an experience that will just like fade into the background of like all of the other things that I've read, because that simplistic style and the very generic and derivative plot make it feel like you're just reading something you've read before like a million other times. And I feel like that's why I lost all of the details to time in my memory. And even though this is a reread, I will again lose all of the details to time in my memory. I didn't particularly like the main character. She had a lot of things that she was facing in terms of challenges, and I understood her plight, but her voice and the way that she often dealt with things came across a little too whiny for me. I didn't super love any of her relationships with either of the princes, and all of these are things that I had issue with when I first read it. I think I said in my original video that I would give it between 2 and 3 stars, where now that adjusted rating to years later is probably like 1.5 to 2 stars, but all of the things that I said about the book holds generally. So yeah, this wasn't great, and somehow it was still the best reading experience I've had so far. Jesus. I've already started reading Rebel of the Sands, the 2016 winner, and first impressions are that it started off really strong. The first scene or two was like really interesting, but the further we go along, the more that it's feeling like uncomfortably tropey in the way that it is representing the Middle East. And like, I'm still early enough that I'm just I'm side-eyeing, so we'll see how that continues to go. And then the 2017 winner is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which I have already read. I also have a standalone review up for this on my channel, and I'm in the same position where I originally thought I would reread this, specifically because I wonder how this will hit in 2023 and like how it holds up. It was a very memorable reading experience, and this is a book that has found like incredible success, so it makes me curious to revisit it. But I'm running out of time, so you know, I said that last time and it came back and I was like, I reread it, so we'll see what happens. But those are the next two on tap. I finished Rebel of the Sands, and my feelings are a little all over the place with this one, but first, some stats. This was a 2016 winner. It currently has a 3.96 rating overall on Goodreads, and that is with 59,467 ratings. This is a YA fantasy, and it is a blend of like Western, like Wild Wild West, and Middle Eastern inspired. Our main character Amani is a gunslinger in a small desert town. She wants to get out of this small town. She's currently living with her uncle after her parents have died, and he's got his eyes on her to become one of his wives. So she wants to make a break for it, and she crosses paths with a foreigner, and because people know that they were together, her only real choice is to leave with the foreigner. It had potential in certain areas, but it also had some flaws. Firstly, I think that the pacing was uneven. There were times that I was enjoying the slower pace, but sometimes that it felt a little bit like a slog. And then it had these moments where it just like pick up and shoot away. So the opening scenes were great. They hooked my attention immediately. They go on the run, and then we fast forward like 6 weeks or something like that. And then the core of their relationship would have been built along that time. So it was kind of like, wait, hold on a second. And then we kind of slog through some of their traveling to a point where I was like, yeah, good job fast forwarding, because you're right, I didn't want to see that. But then it would pick up in some of these action sequences that I was like, whoa, 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 what's happening? So overall, pretty uneven. I also felt like it was super repetitive at points, and especially with like certain phrases and nicknames and things, like the nickname that he gives her is Bandit, but they use it over and over and over again. Like one of those things where like you don't call somebody by their name that often when you're in conversation, but it just kept happening. And then also Amani kept thinking about herself like, I'm a desert girl, I'm a desert girl. And it happened so much that all I kept hearing was like, I'm an island girl. But with desert, and that was Amani way, way, way too often. Some of that repetition goes hand in hand with how generic this one also felt. The plot was super predictable to me. Like, it had this one element where these magical creatures have like defining features, whether that's special colored hair or special colored eyes. And we spend the entire story going on and on and on about our main character's special colored eyes in a way that it was like bashing us over the head. But also at some points it didn't make sense. Like she's like, I'm going under disguise and I'll cover everything but my eyes. And her eyes are like super special colored. And then people would be like, I saw your blue eyes yesterday. And she's like, how did they know? And I was like, no, stop it immediately. Some of the other like twists and turns as it applied to the characters I thought was also really predictable. The relationship overall between Amani and Jin was like fine. It felt a little bit tropey sometimes. Some of the lines like to describe their feelings or when they were kissing were also really cheesy, like a little cringe. I wouldn't call them like especially memorable or like they had a ton of chemistry between them. Okay, so all of that was like mid. Following up on my first impressions, I do feel like some of the representation here is really stereotypical and really shallow, and in a way that I can't necessarily speak to. It was one of those things where you're reading and you're like, cringing. Like, I feel like this isn't right. I'm going to try and find some own voices reviews if I can and link them in the description, because it just felt like every stereotype you've ever heard about a Middle Eastern person or Middle Eastern place, especially around the violence and the treatment of women. Because it was so shallow, it just felt thrown on top of this world and not treated with any care. It wasn't making any sort of commentary. It was just like, oh, I know these pieces from this culture, or I think I know these stereotypes from this culture, and I'm going to use that to build a world. There was also this like weird xenophobia going on, and some of it was being used to like mark the bad guys, right? Like the bad guys were like, ew, foreigners. But then she would talk about foreigners in a way like the main character in the narration. It was like, wait a second. Like at one point, the main character was like, they're speaking in their gross foreign language and things like that, that I was just like, this story doesn't have a good view of foreigners, and that also made me uncomfortable. So yeah, I gotta give this another 1 star, unfortunately. That's like 0 for 4 for me, but the next winner is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. That's what I'm gonna focus on for the rest of the night, is finishing this off. And then the 2018 winner is Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. I started this the year that it came out, and I read 50% of it and then DNF'd. The good news is that I was reading it quickly. It's not something where I'm like, oh my god, it's gonna be such hard work to read this. It was reading incredibly quickly, but it was also just like very generic and a bunch of nothing. I wasn't super interested, so I just put it aside and I was like, nah. So I have a feeling that I will be able to read through this quickly. I'll be very curious to see if it was just a mood thing back then, or if this is just a bunch of nothing. We are really down to the wire here, but I finished rereading The Hate U Give last night. This is a YA contemporary about a young black girl who sees her friend murdered by a police officer in front of her, and this sparks protest, and so she finds herself having to deal with the loss of her friend, but also being at the heart of sort of the narrative of this all. Okay, some stats for The Hate U Give. It has an overall 4.49 stars on Goodreads, and that is with 795,746 ratings. I think that this really stands up. I gave it, I think, 4 or 4.5 stars when I originally read it, and that's where I would put it today as well. I was thinking a lot about like the sort of backlash that this started to get post popularity, right? When a piece of media hits a sort of critical mass, there is that like wave of backlash that comes against it. I think a lot of that backlash, or at least the part of it that I have seen, really comes from this book being like the black book for a long time, and Angie Thomas being like the one who achieved that level of success. This is sort of like a topic book as well, and a book that explores like violence against black communities. And so all of those things together invite the sort of criticism of like what becomes popular and the tendency within publishing to sort of elevate token stories. And while I think that there is definitely conversation to be had there about the whiteness of publishing, the stories that we elevate, and why there isn't more room at the table for more than one kind of story and more than one author at a time or whatnot, I don't think any of that is this book's fault or Angie Thomas's fault. I think that this set out to do something that it very much achieved. Upon reread, my favorite part of this is still very much the family dynamics. I love the Carter family a whole heck of a lot. I love their dynamic. I love how they talk to each other and relate to each other and interact with each other, the struggles that they go through. I love how present the parents are in the story, and it is a story that is still very young adult focused. I think that was one of the things that I was struck most by on reread, is that this isn't one of those YA books that is YA because it has a teen, but it feels written towards the adults that read YA. This feels like a young adult book that is very much for its intended audience. The second thing that I was really struck with is how mild the politics are in this. I think that this is probably very purposefully palatable in what it is saying. It has taken these ideas of police reform and police brutality and the sort of institutional ways that communities of color are constantly under attack, and it's coming from this place that feels like to me that, again, the intended audience, like this is trying to spoon feed them some things and in a way that will help make it go down easy. I think the thing that stuck out to me the most in that regard is the uncle who is a cop, but he's one of the good ones, and all of the lines about like one of the good cops and whatnot. And there is some contending with that throughout the story, but for the most part it leaves us with this idea of like there's some good ones out there. And so that's kind of an uncomplicated look at police brutality and police reform, and I understand why it's delivered that way in this story, but I was like, That all said, I would still give this like a 4 or 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's easy to forget now that the moment that this came out in, like the freshness of the story and somebody talking about this topic so boldly, so it's easy to lose that like in reading and looking back and whatnot. But this is one that I'm like, yes, okay, this one I feel like should have won. It was the moment. I did also start reading Children of Blood and Bone, and I really don't have many first impressions. The first scene or two was like pretty gripping. I'm curious like where this lost me and if I'll be able to identify why and how this lost me. Again, just curious if it was a mood thing or if it's a book thing, but yes, we have started there. And then the next one after that is the 2019 winner, which is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I have avoided reading this book, to be very honest with you. I think it was Sam from Thoughts on Tomes who talked about it and gave a review about how this is like a political fantasy, almost like an AU where like the politics are all right and like the, I don't know, headspace that you need to be in to enjoy that. And hearing her talk about it in that way, I was like, yeah, that's not for me. That's not something I'm interested in. And so my first Casey McQuiston was actually One Last Stop, and I really did not have a good time with that. I really did not like the kind of story that it was. Like I had a lot of issues with that story, the construction of it, and there were also some like weird and problematic aspects. So I was kind of like, I don't know that I need to read more Casey McQuiston, and here I am. So we're gonna do it. My really lofty goal is to finish both of these books today, but I'm going to my mom's house. We have family dinner on Sundays. Like I don't know where I'm gonna have the time to finish these books tonight, but you know, between today and tomorrow, I've got a lot of books to finish. I stayed up super late reading last night, so I didn't record an update, but I did finish 2 more books on my list. I finished Children of Blood and Bone, and this is a YA fantasy in which there is a world where people used to have magic abilities and a connection to the gods, but magic was taken from the world, and now these magic wielders are under the thumb of a violent monarchy until an artifact is discovered that could bring magic back into the world, and our main characters are pulled into the path, the adventure of trying to get these artifacts together and perform the ritual that would bring magic back. For some stats here, this has an average 4.11 rating on Goodreads, and that is with 206,703 reviews. This is not the worst thing that I read on this list. Like it's just fine. It's okay. There isn't anything sort of offensively bad about this, but I totally see why I just gave up on this midway through when I first tried to read it. There is something a little soulless about this. I think it became too tropey and a little too generic, and I really didn't have a strong connection to any of the characters. A lot of times the things that they were going through and the resolutions to their conflicts and even the connections that they were forming felt a little too contrived. And that was the thing, is that everything I was reading just like sort of missed the mark in some way. It felt a little too this or not enough that, like through the entire reading experience. The characters didn't feel 3D, they felt like types, and because of that, a lot of their actions felt telegraphed to me as well. It felt like we were just going through the motions, honestly, for me. And there was this weird unevenness when it came to like the stakes and how everybody was reacting to the situations around them. There were moments that I felt were like over dramatic. I was like, everybody calm down. I understand you're teens, but let's get it together here. And there were other moments where I was like, nobody's taking this seriously enough. Like there was a lot of physical violence in here that was a little matter of fact to me, and those stakes kind of compared against some of the other stakes made it feel patchy. And the freshest and most exciting thing about this was the setting, but it wasn't even something that I think was explored and used to its fullest potential. I would give this 2 out of 5 stars. And then I also read Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is an adult romance about the first son of the United States and an English prince who basically start to form a friendship for appearances for the press, so that connection grows stronger and they end up romantically involved. This has an average 4.13 rating on Goodreads, and that is with 683,550 ratings. I want to be enjoying these books, trust me. I mentioned it in an earlier clip that I was avoiding this one for like the sort of AU political fantasy that this is, and just kind of knowing that that wouldn't be my cup of tea, and then also having a bad experience with One Lost Stop and thinking that maybe McQuiston wasn't the author for me, and both of those things were truly confirmed by reading Red, White, and Royal Blue. I think that this did some things well. I think that this had good moments and some good interactions between our two main characters, but also the supporting characters as well. It also had some moments that I thought were a little bit cheesy, and sometimes where the banter was like, all right already. But this is another one where I can see the appeal primarily because of that group of interactions and characters. Unfortunately, that wasn't strong enough to sort of counterbalance all of the ways that this wasn't for me, and also I think that it wasn't particularly well done, especially because it had those good moments, but I was a little bit confused about the characters themselves. Like when I started describing this, I almost said that this was a YA romance, and I had to remember that these characters were in their 20s, and some of their like actions, decisions, some of the way they talked, like sometimes it felt like I was listening to 30-year-olds talking, and I was like, what, okay. And then other times I was like, is this a teen? So that like patchiness didn't always work for me in terms of the characterization. The thing here really for me was this whole idea of like an AU political fantasy. The story itself kept bringing up all of these topics that cannot be treated, at least to me, for my enjoyment in this way where I could either suspend all of this disbelief or that I would be satisfied with like the barest nods to these really difficult and important topics, including colonialism and racism and like healthcare in the United States and in the UK and the two-party system and politics. And it just kept bringing all of these things up to be like, yuck, yuck, yuck. And just centered like the whitest, most American take that you could have on any of these topics. It didn't feel like there was like even a true understanding where it was like joking or making light of these things with like a deep understanding where we were all in on the joke. It felt like it was asking you to just like pay no attention to the things that it was mentioning. One of the things that I deeply disliked about One Last Stop was the way that the characters of color were portrayed. So the main love interest is a woman of color, and she is extremely passive throughout the story, and the interaction with the main character becomes a white savior sort of thing. There are also some background characters of color who become these like sage and wise and quirky, just like caricatures of themselves. And so I was like deeply uncomfortable with the way that race was handled in One Last Stop. So when I read that in Red, White, and Royal Blue, Alex was Mexican, I was like, no, Casey, why? Casey. Especially when you consider that this is like the AU where like Trump never became president and we have a woman president, and part of the way that they fix it is like to imagine if this like first son was Mexican, and that's like the counterbalance to Trump in the White House. And there's something about that that is a little cringe to me, including the random addition of Spanish words in one scene where Alex just randomly calls somebody vato. I think it happens once too. This isn't like something that is regularly part of his vocabulary. He just calls a character vato, not even like another Mexican character. I get it if this was like a romantic fantasy that worked for you, but it just incredibly did not for me. All of the pieces actually propping up the romance here failed for me, but because there were like scenes and smaller moments that I was like, okay, that's cute, that's fine, I would give this like a 2 out of 5 stars. Okay, I've got essentially the rest of the day to finish this out. I do have a little bit of time tomorrow morning before this video goes live. I have been editing as I go, so I just really need to plop in the final clips, and we're like in pretty good shape. But this is the moment that's going to call into question like my whole commitment to the bit of this project, because to this point I have even reread all of the books that I've already read. And in my head, when I was thinking about this project, I knew that I wanted to reread Such a Fun Age, which is the next winner on my list. I read this the year that it came out and I absolutely loved it, and I need a win, I feel like, here, which is one plus of rereading, but also I want to refresh my memory and see how it stands up. I feel like I could do that and still read the one book that I actually have to read that I haven't read at all, which is Lessons in Chemistry. So this needs to be read today. I have 3 books left, and this is the only one that I actually haven't read, which leaves me with the dilemma of needing to and wanting to read this book. And then that 3rd book is The Spanish Love Deception by Elena. I read it like a year ago. It is truly burned on my brain. Like I don't need a refresher there. At least I don't need a refresher in terms of my feelings and my deep dislike of that book. Spoiler alert. But now, like, I feel so committed to the bit that I've like read and reread all of these and all of the winners. Like, I didn't even go to any backups, that I'm like, do I reread The Spanish Love Deception? You know, your girl sometimes gets committed to a bit, and like, I'm like, do I do this? I just finished rereading Such a Fun Age, and this held up so well for me. This is an adult contemporary story about a young woman named Amira. She's in her mid-20s, and she's working several part-time jobs, including one where she is babysitting for a well-to-do family. This book really is about Amira navigating her life, her relationship with her employers who are white, a new boyfriend who is also white, and just trying to figure out exactly what she wants to do with her life. A lot of times when this book is described, the inciting incident is used, and it is Amira with her young charge at a grocery store, and somebody assumes Amira has like kidnapped this little girl basically, and the entire confrontation and interaction is caught on camera. So there is an element of this that is about existing while black, but it isn't like the full thing here. So if you focus too much on the like caught on camera aspect of it, you might be disappointed by the larger existing while black themes in this story. Before I go into more of my feelings, this has an average 3.82 rating on Goodreads, making this the lowest rated of all of the books on this list, and that is with 458,379 ratings. I just, you know, I can see why the story wouldn't be for certain readers, but I don't know how you argue that this didn't do what it set out to do effectively. This feels closest to me to like a disaster girl novel, like a Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, Pizza Girl by Jean Young Fraser. I would even say maybe like Otessa Moshfegh, but this is less weird. This is a lot more accessible, I think, than any of those books that I've mentioned. There is a sort of openness in her writing and a matter-of-factness in her writing that I think makes this like in that same category, but a lot more commercial and accessible. I think that this can be an incredibly frustrating reading, and it's supposed to be. Reid gets the exact right balance right to me in terms of writing things that are just incredibly relatable at points, and like her descriptions specifically in the observational wit just come together to create circumstances or descriptions in smaller spaces. Like, it will be a random description of an apartment or like of a moment or of a feeling in a moment that I'm like, I know exactly what she's talking about. Like, I've been there, I've met that place, I felt that feeling. But at the same time, there are other things that are exaggerated, or they feel that way as they exist within the story. And that's where a lot of the humor comes in. And I think that a lot of times when you do have these disaster girl novels, you have these exaggerations of circumstances and things like that that really give it that disaster flair. And like I said, I think Reid does nail the balance of all of that. This is my second time reading this, and I still had moments where I was like laughing out loud. I knew how it ended, but I was still like, you know, on the edge of my seat as we got to the resolution and everything. So it held up to a reading. And in fact, I feel like I was looking at this through an additional lens. Like, I had these feelings when I first read it, but since my first reading in this, I joined TikTok and I've been active on TikTok. And so I've had all of these thoughts about TikTok and a way that a lot of the culture on TikTok and a lot of the trends are powered by Black women, and probably not with all of the credit that Black women deserve. So thinking about that and just seeing the way that everybody feels entitled to Amira and Amira's time, and even like Amira's hopes and dreams, specifically Alex, the way that she is like obsessed and almost has this like weird in love feeling with Amira, I think captures so well the way that people can love Black culture without seeing like Black people as individuals, or respecting them or their boundaries, or treating them like full and complete humans. And that is so wonderfully captured in the entire interaction between Alex and Amira. I think a lot of people also struggle with the open ending of this, but I love an open ending as it is. A well-deployed open ending is so delicious to me, but I think it is especially just wonderful in this story. I think it says so much. First of all, about Amira, and Amira being such an easygoing person, at least in terms of like being good at several things, but not like being amazing, not being a very like passion-driven person, but wanting to like get by and survive and do good at what she's doing. And so the way that it ends with her like finding a space for herself, but in a very almost neutral way of it being like, you know, and she made it out of her 20s. I super appreciate that. I think it fits in well with the character, but I also just love what it says about the story. I think that people get so frustrated that this doesn't have a cleaner ending, but I'm like dying to know what sort of clean ending racism has. Like, in what world does this end any other way but like, you know, everybody just kept living their lives, and the white people who were on that spectrum of like wokeness to racism and everything in between get to just keep living their lives with really little to no consequences. And that's the way that it is. And even looking back on it, there isn't any grand lesson that Amira like pulls away from this, because there shouldn't be, that burden shouldn't be on the Black people experiencing racism in their lives to like use it to better themselves or look at some grand lesson. She just is able to look at it and be like, damn, that happens. And I love that. I love this ending so much, and I think it is perfect for this book. This was 5 out of 5 stars when I first read it. 5 out of 5 stars still. I did it. It is February 14th, so you guys will literally be seeing this in just a couple of hours here, but I did it, so let's wrap this up. First, starting off with The Spanish Love Deception. This is an adult romance about two work rivals, but the woman basically needs a date to go to a wedding where her ex will be, and the man agrees to fake date her. This has a 3.91 average rating on Goodreads with 480,802 ratings. I hated this. I actually can't remember now if I ended up reading the self-published version, because this was self-published. It got super popular on TikTok, and then it was acquired and traditionally published. I'm almost certain I read the self-published version. So going back, there were things that I'm like, is this cleaner in the traditional published version? Like maybe a little bit tighter, but I'm not sure that it ultimately makes a difference. However, this is a bunch of my least favorite tropes jammed together, and even one of my favorite tropes, fake dating, can't save it. I really don't enjoy enemies to lovers or rivals to lovers, especially in contemporary settings. The fact that these two people at the beginning of the story are fighting the way that they do and at odds the way that they are, just, it is not entertaining to me. How old are they? Really, when you find out why this whole thing is going on, it's like, are you serious right now? In my place of work, in an office, we're doing this right now? I honestly, like, that really took me out of it, and it goes hand in hand with not liking the main character and this being so long and drawn out. It is way too many pages. It is way too many pages, and we spend way too much time up at the front in the setup and at the worst part of both of these characters' arcs. And to say that they have an arc is a little bit of an exaggeration because it's one of those like, oh, we were misunderstanding each other all along kind of things. This is so dragged down. There's so much repetition in here. We get the setup for like the fake dating multiple times in the first like 200 pages before we ever move on and get to the second half of the story, which feels super disconnected disconnected from like the workplace romance that starts this off. With the main male character, we also spend so much time in the worst part of his arc, and it's just all wooden. He's like giving nothing, and it might be purposeful because he's like the grumpy portion of all of this, but then like he's giving nothing for 200 plus pages, and I'm just like, what? Why is this happening? I don't have any answers to why any of this happened. I just know that I did not have a good time. I gave this 1 out of 5 stars. And finally, the last book, I finished Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmas. This is a story about a chemist named Elizabeth Zott in the 1950s and 60s, and just kind of following the difficulties of her career, her falling in love, and then becoming somewhat of a breakout success as a cooking show host. I really enjoyed this. I can see why this is divisive. I featured this book in a book haul, and I had a few people tell me like, oh, I can't wait till you read it. So I was kind of bracing myself to not enjoy this, but I very much did. So first of all, this is a character-driven story. So all my plot girlies, see yourself out. This is also a disaster girl kind of novel, but quirkier. So it's like a little Sally Rooney, a little Maria Semple kind of thing. This also deals with a lot of like character types. So you have the aloof woman scientist, and like the precocious child, and the nosy neighbor, and things like that. But I thought that these character types still came to life within the story, because the story itself is kind of absurd and sometimes exaggerated, sometimes dark, and sometimes darkly funny. And so it goes between all of these different elements, and it even has like this splash of magical realism in the form of a super smart dog. Like, so that splash of magical realism is also something I super enjoy. I feel like this is kind of a weird book. I love character studies. I love disaster girl novels. All of those things came together to make a book that I could really enjoy, and I thought that this was well written and well executed. The only real complaint that I have about this is that I wish it were a little bit shorter and tighter. I feel like this would have been more effective. I think it would have retained a lot more of the naysayers if it was just tighter and faster. And some of the places it could have cut down were the big speeches, some of the like on the nose feminism sort of thing. And like I said, this does deal with dark and difficult subjects, her being a woman in the workplace and a woman in STEM in the 1950s and 60s. So definitely check out the trigger warnings. A lot of this stuff is on page, so it has these super dark moments. I don't think that the book ever treats them with levity, but the book itself does have moments of levity. And in response to everything that the main character goes through, this does have like thoughts about women in the workplace and women in STEM and women can do things and whatnot. So if that sort of brand of on the nose girl powerly feminism is also not for you, it is a feature in here. This also is set in a past and has modern sensibilities. So if that sort of anachronism is going to bother you, it will also bother you here. But I just thought that this was so charming. It came together well for me. It was well written. And I think even with its faults, like this is the kind of book that I'm like, yes, I understand why this won. So yay, another one where I understand why it won. 4 out of 5 stars. So here are some final thoughts on this project. I think I said at some point in this video that I wanted to like more of these books, and I just did not. My average star rating across these 10 books is 2.35. So that's pretty abysmal. That's pretty bad. Here on the screen, I'm going to show these all like in order according to their average Goodreads rating. This is super interesting to me because like the bones of it, I feel like are similar to mine with a couple of key exceptions, too high and too low, including Such a Fun Age being number 10 here because this is my ranking. Such a Fun Age is the best book on this entire list. I would give number 2 to The Hate You Give and then Lessons in Chemistry. Those are difficult to compare, but I think my ratings go quality and enjoyment, and because of those two things combined, I have to give it to The Hate You Give over Lessons in Chemistry. The bottom row was the most difficult for me to sort of arrange because I'm like taking into account how bad the book was plus all of the problematic aspects, like trying to make decisions about like, is this racism or is this misogyny worse? You know, I will say that the worst book by far, like just the worst, technically the worst in terms of enjoyment and experience, was Tangled by Emma Chase. And just looking at this list of books, I don't understand that one at all, because all of these other books, even though we're in the debut category, had some measure of popularity and success. There was some like marketing or word of mouth thing happening there. I don't know if like Tangled was huge and I never heard about it, or what was happening on Goodreads in 2013, but that's the outlier to me. The only books that I would say are deserving of winning are those top three, so Such a Fun Age, The Hate You Give, and Lessons in Chemistry. Some other interesting things is that this list is half young adult and half adult novels. There are 3 contemporary books here, 3 fantasies, 3 romance, and 1 sci-fi. There were 7 books written by white people and 3 books written by Black women, and like nothing else in between. I think 30% non-white might be higher than other categories, but that's just my guess. So at the end of this, I'm kind of asking myself, what is it that connects all of these books? When you have awards that are curated, you have your own set of problems because curation introduces bias. But when you have the Goodreads Choice Awards, which is based purely on popularity, you literally select the most read books and from there let just people vote. What you're going to end up with more often than not is just this list of things that were most popular at the time. I will say that I do think that there are similarities here. I wouldn't describe any of these books as being written in a particularly flowery way or dense way. They all range from like accessible to just like simple and poorly written, but overall they are all incredibly readable. They're very readable books, very simply written, and I think that makes sense when you're talking about popularity. You're going to want the kind of thing that like the most people can get into, and I feel like we see that reflected in the kind of writing that showed up here over and over again. I also feel like I used the word generic like 76 times in this entire video, but so much of this was so generic. It was so tropey. It felt super derivative of things that had found success in that category. Also, unfortunately, like I don't know that this is like a connecting thread, but I think it's worth mentioning that I would call all of these books like problematic, either because of portrayals of race or misogyny. I don't know what it is, why this is happening. And even the top 3 books that have actually done it well are about racism and racial violence and misogyny. Those are key themes that are well explored in my top 3 books. But then in the bottom, there are so many of these that aren't really interested in exploring it, but introduced it, whether intentionally or not, in a problematic way for the reader. The last thing I want to say is that some of these titles are HarperCollins titles, and at the time that this is going to go up, there is a tentative agreement on the table, but it has not been approved and finalized, so we're still holding the line here, but I'm very hopeful that this will be resolved soon. I will leave the links in the description for supporting the union, and that's it. I did it. Wow. I'm like sitting here thinking about how I read 10 books in 13 days, and the last 5 of them in the last like 48 hours, but I did it. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat down in the comments. All of the other videos in this project will be linked in the playlist in the description, so you can hear it if everybody else had as bad an experience as I did. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Inflated style and are like, oh, that's better. I don't. So I feel like people read or read. Just snorted. Woo. No, stop, buddy. Okie dokie. You know, and that feels like a doable plan. She says, hopefully. What a wild ride.